Welcome to Ministries That Podcast, where I talk to successful ministry leaders about how they're using podcasting to amplify their mission and grow their ministry so you can too. I'm Tim Hall, your host and owner of Sonomorphic, a podcast production company that specializes in podcasting for ministries. My guest today is Anthony Russo, the creator behind The Bible is Funny, an Instagram account that later became a podcast and even a card game. He's the pastor of creative ministries at Calvary Church in Clearwater, Florida, and the author of a 60-day devotional titled Curiosities and Uncommon Sense from the Bible. In today's episode, Anthony and I are going to talk about where the idea for The Bible is Funny came from, how this project has been an effort to get people to engage with the Bible, and how podcasting can build deeper relationships with your audience. So let's get right to it. Here's my conversation with Anthony Russo. Anthony, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, man. So I think I first heard about The Bible is Funny probably on Instagram, through the Instagram account, and then seeing the card game. And I thought, man, this is a fantastic, hilarious idea to take verses out of context on purpose and then making a game out of it. Then I did a little clicking around, saw you had a podcast. And so I thought it'd be great to chat with you and hear more about what you're doing with The Bible is Funny. So to start off, take me back to when you first had this idea. What was going through your mind, and how did it develop into an Instagram account and then later a podcast?
Yeah. First of all, let me say, just being on the Ministries That podcast, it's very I feel like I got to be on my best behavior because you're like the expert of podcasts. In my head, I'm like, how do you answer questions? I'm looking at right now, is my mic in the right spot? I don't know. He knows.
It is.
And I don't know. I'm just making everything up as I go along. Oh man, I've been at this 7 or 8 years, I think total. It was conceived with a thought. I really was looking for a project to work on, kind of a bigger scale project. I had a couple of things coming together at the same time. And one of the thoughts that hit me during this time was that I was not as familiar with the Bible. When I was real with myself, I was not as familiar with the Bible as I would I think a lot of people around me probably would have assumed I was. There were whole chunks of the Bible that I didn't know anything about. And so the initial idea that hit and stuck was I was like, man, I go around telling people the Bible is a holy book. It's a life-changing book. It's this book. It's the book, and it's God's word, right? We use these words. But then you're like, well, what's going on in Numbers? And I'm like, oh, I don't really know what's going on in Numbers. But the other parts I like a lot. And so the first funny aha moment I had was imagine if people did this with other books here, other books, just going there. Imagine if someone was like, man, I am a diehard Harry Potter fan, for example. I love Harry Potter so much. It's the best book series. And you were like, oh, so you know what happens in the second book. No, I don't. I've not read that. I'm not familiar with that. But the book series is so good. And so it just kind of struck me that there was this gap between how much I had actually explored the Bible for myself, not through sermons that were taught to me and that kind of thing, but actually going in there, seeing what the thing says. If I'm going to talk about this book as much as I have talked about this book, I should be more familiar with it. So that was kind of the ultimate genesis of the Bible is Funny project, came from that combination of things. And personal faith history, I've been in church my whole life. I've been in church since my first memories are being in church. And so it was kind of that moment that then was born into all right, well, I'm going to explore this thing and I'm going to just kind of see what happens. So I started very slowly reading through the Bible. I started getting up every morning and really intentionally and slowly reading through the Bible. And I started to notice stuff that I hadn't noticed before because I had never done something like this. So I started to notice passages and texts and individual verses that I were like, I would have never guessed this was in here. And so while that was going on, I was also realizing that was becoming a thing for people, was even people that grew up in church like I did, they were so unfamiliar with the Bible that then they were presented something that was in the Bible and they were kind of off balance with it. They were like, I don't know, I didn't know that was in there. So I don't know how to respond to someone who has a thought on why that is in the Bible or just pointing something like that out. So all those things were swirling. Then personally, I have a history in comedy. That's always been a part of me. So I've done improv comedy since I was in high school and traveled the country and toured doing that. So all of those things came together. Also, a website called Instagram rolled out, and that started to become really popular. And so all of that kind of led to this thing. So it started with the very first thing I was really pumped on were blogs. For our younger listeners, those were things on the internet a long time ago that people used to write. And it was very, very popular for a minute. So I was like, I'm going to write these blogs, kind of just sharing some of this journey I was on. And I was like, at the same time, I'll post little funny things to Instagram and hopefully that will drive traffic to my blog. The blog never got off the ground. It was never nobody was really interested in it. There was so many reasons for that. Then the Instagram started to like become a thing. I started to put more effort into the Instagram and kind of pivot some of the blog ideas and concepts and rework them. And so then I was able to do the podcast. I started that in 2020. And then I was able to write a book and now a card game. And the card game has been the latest thing we've done that's been super fun. So that's kind of the short story of the journey of the Bible is funny, but that's what it's looked like.
Yeah, that's great. So I read that you're an ordained minister and you're currently the pastor of creative ministries at your church. So I'd love to hear, as you're doing this and growing it from this idea, you're starting the Instagram account. What's it like to be a content creator and a pastor at the same time?
Well, for me, it was always like, these have been just the most natural expressions. Yeah. Like, it's my faith, it's comedy, it's loving people and caring for them and introducing them to the hope of the gospel. All of those things are always living congruently at the same time. So I'm always like, I don't know how to do it any different. Yeah. This just seems to always be the thing because there's so much crossover, right? Like, I'm learning things on Instagram and TikTok and through podcasting that then I go and I'm able to help my church to like better communicate, better share the message, more creatively bring things to life. So I've always felt like they were really symbiotic because I always feel like there will be a version of both of those things going on at all times. The pastoral work I've always loved. I just love people. And really the heartbeat of everything I do is I want people to know this story. I want people to know how much God loves them. I want people to know those things. So as approachable as I can make that, that's what I want to do. So the Bible is funny is an expression of that. And then also serving at a church and being able to say like, hey, how can we let as many people as possible know that they're invited into this thing?
Yeah. Yeah. So actually I want to dive into that a little bit deeper. So I think maybe it was on another podcast or something that found out that you grew up doing Awana, going to church every week and all of that. And I did as well. The church is a pretty comfortable place for people like us, but that's not everyone's experience of the Bible and church. And so describe how this project has actually been a great effort to get people to open their Bibles and make it more approachable.
Yeah, that's absolutely like one of the driving passions behind this whole thing, because something that became very clear to me is when kids are younger and we are introducing them to the Bible, we do it often creatively. There's coloring sheets involved. There's flannel graphs involved, right? We're bringing this thing to life. We're using our imagination. We're encouraging them to use their imagination. This is how we introduce people to the Bible. It's becoming more and more common that people are being introduced to the Bible later in life because they didn't grow up going to church. One of the things I thought was like, there's got to be more tools for someone to start an interaction with the Bible that is not like, here's 50 things you need to change about your life right now, like if you would like to participate in this. Again, it doesn't mean that those things aren't relevant. It doesn't mean that those things will not come up, that through the process of sanctification, people won't have things that they come across. But it's to say that they got to be able to start somewhere. There has to be some sort of like front door to this whole thing. So yeah, the church, the Bible, it's all felt so home to me. I don't know. I was actually just talking about this recently with my co-host, Tim, and we just said like, we walk into any church and it just feels like we're supposed to be there. Like we just have grown up in this thing. His parents were missionaries. There's this comfort that we know that's not everyone's experience. And some people have real hurt and trauma that they have to overcome to get to that front door. If the Bible is funny can be something that somebody says like, oh man, I'm overcoming some things. This is keeping me connected to the Bible and this faith that's really important to me as I am healing and working my way back to being able to engage in some other ways. That's great. But it's always been a real passion of mine that this is something that people can have no background with the Bible and go like, that's interesting that you're talking. I didn't know that was in the Bible and you're addressing it openly. You're acknowledging it's in there. It's interesting. It's curious. It piques their curiosity. So 100%, that's been a heartbeat of the project from the beginning.
Yeah. So what's a story that you've heard of somebody like having that experience of either playing the card game and being like, this is in the Bible and then digging into it? I'd love to hear some of those stories.
That's the story we get all the time, especially with the card game. A lot of people, if a listener hasn't seen or heard of the card game, it plays kind of like apples to apples. Yeah. So there'll be a prompt and then there's all these like wildly out of context Bible verses that you're using just to like make something funny that everybody can laugh about. But it has led almost daily, I'm getting messages of like, we had to stop the game and see what is that verse about? And like what story, what context did it all come in? So they're learning anytime you do that, anytime you dig in, you're going to learn something. You're going to see something. So yeah, I hear that story all the time. I think most commonly there's a King James Version translation that translates a word unicorn, So a lot of scholars believe it's like a rhino, but the King James translation says unicorn. So there's a verse in the card game that says he hath the strength of an unicorn. And so I get a lot of feedback from that one. Like we had to stop and go, there's no way a unicorn is mentioned in the Bible. And I'm like, it's in there. Again, probably not a unicorn, but it's mentioned.
That's really funny. So you mentioned in 2020, you started the podcast and published your first episode in April. What role did COVID play in deciding to do that? And then what was the decision also that led you to take what you've been doing on Instagram and just make it a podcast as well?
Yeah, I mean, from the story, like I told you with the story, the longer form talking about and unpacking these things was always really interesting to me. And at the time, I thought blogs were a medium that it would translate because I do love to write. What was interesting about COVID was a lot of our live stage performance stuff was taken. We weren't doing that. Honestly, my biggest hang up, because of the timing, and you're just so good at podcasts, you with your homework and your dates you have lined up. I'm feeling just really like I have a lot of room to grow as a podcaster. But COVID really, I mean, yes, we were definitely home more. I will say getting guests became really doable because all of a sudden these like guests who you couldn't get before because they were traveling, doing tours or whatever. We had Chris Llewellyn from Wren Collective was one of our earlier guests because it was like he couldn't tour, so he's at his house anyway. Join the podcast. Getting guests became a little bit more of like an interesting, like we might be able to land some bigger guests than we would normally. But really, it was on my heart for a long time before that. I loved the podcasting platform. I like conversations. I like telling stories. I like having a space where you can create this weirdly, like the 1.5 speed idea. I love so much that I'm just like, I'm kind of a slower talker, I think. Creating 45 minutes of content, you know, when it was like everything was really short, really compressed, but it's like, okay, so 45 minutes felt super long, but then all of a sudden you could do it at 1.5 speed. And it was like, oh, it's not that long. It's like one drive somewhere. So it was all super interesting to me. And 2020 was just the time when I was like, it just kind of like broke. I was like, I gotta do this. I was really feeling a lot of like, there's so many podcasts. I missed the first wave. Nobody needs this podcast. But then it just became that kind of like creative burden that I think people that have been in that seat are like, I have to get this out of me. Like I gotta get it out. It's too, I just have to try it. I think I did 2 I never aired that I was just feeling out the platform and trying it to see what I was doing here. From there, we were off and running.
Nice. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about how you took what you were already doing and created it into a long form content. Because like you were basically making these meme type posts on Instagram. How did you decide to, okay, this is how I'm going to take the same kind of content, but then let's make it a conversation?
Some of the things that became super interesting were when you're doing like a meme or a Instagram exclusive type of communication or creating content for that platform, it is very limited in the amount. There's literal character limits, right? On like Twitter and X and even Instagram captions. Podcasting gave me the space to say all that I wanted to say, right? Because I'm addressing the Bible, which is something I take really, really seriously. And the first thing people do when they come across the Bible is funny is they're like, oh, this is like a we hate the Bible page. This is a like faith isn't real page. They make a lot of assumptions because there's a lot of that content out there. We found a way to create within that and people could see really the heartbeat of what we were doing. But then the podcast became an opportunity of like, hey, we can say exactly what it is we're doing here. We're not rushed. We're not cramped for time where we can't get the jokes in. We can't get the interesting, curious observations in while also stating what this is and what this isn't. So the podcast platform gave us that space to kind of talk out like, hey, this section we're talking about, there's actually a lot of cool stuff here if you want to dig in somewhere else. That's not what we do here. We're not like theologians. This isn't that kind of podcast, but there is cool stuff here. And I'd like to name that while also telling you, isn't this silly that he has to eat bread baked over poop fire? Like, it's fun. It just created enough space, if that makes sense. Like, so then it was like, yeah, it's easy to have conversations. It's easy to like get with other people. My co-host now, Tim, we get to like riff on stuff and say like, isn't that funny? Can't you kind of read into some of the dialogue a little bit? Yeah. Creates all this space and opportunity because you don't feel so like, I got to make my point in 30 seconds. That's all the time I got.
Right. Yeah. So podcasting is a great way to build relationships with people and in a deeper way than you can on platforms like social media. So how have you seen that true in your experience with starting your podcast and being in both worlds?
So much so. I mean, I think definitely when you think ministry space crossover, we think a lot of times of sermons or lectures. Like we think if we were going to transmit information, that's the way we do it. And we have maybe underestimated the lack of relationship building that really, you're not necessarily relationship building when you're preaching sermons. You're teaching, you're presenting information, and people can certainly respond to that. Relationships can be built out of that, but they don't inherently, not everyone. I will also say that. There are some people who love listening to people preach, and then afterward they're like, I feel like I know them. I feel like we're best friends. I feel like, we're connected. But there are other people who will not feel that way. They will feel like you presented information. I've been presented information a lot. You're presenting information just like any number of other people are presenting information. Podcasts, it's so relational, like it's so conversational. Pretty overwhelmingly with successful podcasts, people feel like they're in the room with two people chatting and they're just getting to be there and participate. And so I think it builds relationship for a larger audience, more overwhelmingly than somebody sitting there listening to you present something. Podcasting makes people feel like they're in on the conversation. They're a part of it. They're welcomed into it. They're invited into it. So I think for me, that's what the podcasting platform does that's so interesting. And I always wanted The Bible is Funny to be an invitation for everyone to explore the Bible with us. It was never supposed to be, watch me explore the Bible. Hey, everybody, watch this. It was supposed to be, you can do this. There's no reason you can't do this. Bibles are accessible. They're free on your phone right now. Like you can do this. And so the podcast was such a natural extension of that. And it is my favorite feedback I get on the project is people sending me screenshots of like, I had this little thought while I was reading today, or I came across this passage. I thought you'd like it. It just is like goosebumps every time. Cause I'm like, that's what I want. I want you to feel welcomed in. I want you to feel like when you go to the Bible, you can bring your creativity and your imagination and everything that makes you, you, and you can explore this thing. And so I love getting that feedback, and podcasting just kind of enhances that atmosphere.
Yeah, that's really cool. It's great to hear that so many people are doing that they are in turn saying, oh, my friend Anthony, basically, he would be interested in this because he's doing the same thing I'm doing, and I'm doing it because he's doing it. And like, yeah, it's just really cool to hear how people build relationships that way, even though it's not a physical, personal relationship, but they feel like they know you. And so that's really cool. As you look back on your podcast journey, as you've been doing it for about 4 years now, how has the podcast helped you amplify your mission and grow your ministry of The Bible is Funny?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a way that you can very practically invite people into the conversation, like I was saying, like with having guests on and saying like, even, it's not just your friend Anthony, there's other friends of yours that are doing this and that are engaging with the Bible in this way. And it's a fun activity we can all do. I love the platform for that reason. I mean, I love, like I said, it just is a way to connect. One of my friends that has a podcast put it a great way that like, whatever project you're doing, if it includes a podcast, your podcast people are like your people. He said it as like, in my adult life, like me and my podcasters have spent more time in these like kind of conversational things than me and my dad have. Because you're just like, I don't know, I probably see my dad, depending on where you live and how close and all those things, like there's a lot of time spent. If you're putting out a weekly podcast where you're spending 45 minutes to an hour, even 30 minutes, like in intentional conversation and dialogue, and people are listening to that, like the relationship building is insane. Like you don't do that with most of your, what you would consider good friends. Spend 30 minutes of concerted time listening to them, share their thoughts on any given subject matter. So yeah, I don't know. It has just, podcasting, as much as I resisted it for so long, which is my creative journey, is I resist things till I can't possibly resist them anymore. It has felt like the most natural extension of everything I'm trying to do, everything I'm trying to accomplish with The Bible is Funny.
Yeah, so on the flip side of that, what would you say is been the hardest part about starting a podcast and having a podcast?
I mean, for me, it's like just the imposter syndrome of it all, It's the like, nobody wants to hear what I have to say. Frankly, I'm just like, I don't really have like a unique perspective here. Anytime for me, I approach the Bible, even I fight against a lot of like, well, you don't have the education a lot of people have. You don't have this, you don't have that. You have no business being in this space and taking up space in this arena. I think that to me was the thing that kept me away from it for so long, Because what's interesting about podcasting is it is like a relatively low barrier of entry as far as like if you can get a microphone, you don't even technically need like a nice microphone. Like there's a lot of ways to get a podcast created and out there that don't cost a lot of money. Whereas if you were like, I want to make a TV show, you're a lot of steps away from that. So yeah, that was my biggest hurdle, was just like, there's a lot of podcasts out there. I'm just another, banging cymbal in the wind. Like it just is like, what am I going to do with this thing? But ultimately, you kind of try to be discerning about like, where's that voice coming from? I don't think that's coming from the way that God thinks about me or the way that God views my purpose in the world. So a lot of working through that just to say like, yeah, there are a lot of podcasts. It's true, but there's no reason that, you can't share your story. There's no reason you can't share your perspective. There's no like, this isn't like we're battling for space. There's a lot of internet to take up. You're not like, there's only 2 podcast slots and you're taking one up. Like, no, everybody can do their pod. It's fine. So if that's what you want to bring, then do it. And if that's where you're feeling led into, then follow it.
Yeah. I have a similar backstory too. It was back in 2019 that I was like, I should start a podcast. And I even had ideas and I did one interview. It was a similar idea to what I'm doing now. But it took so long to just be like, no, I can actually do this. I can put together questions and interview people. And it is weird how there's like this fear of doing it. But then once you start doing it, it's like, why was I so afraid of doing this?
Right.
So.
Yeah, that's another good point. And for me, some of it was that like perfection paralysis of like, well, I don't know exactly what I want it to be. And then after I started mine, some good friends of mine that live couple hours from me, they were wrestling through a podcast, and I was able to talk them through like it changes. Like you got to do your first episode because your 10th episode will be different than your first episode, and your 20th episode will be different than your 10th episode.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
If you want to start at episode 50, you'll never start because you can't get there unless you do 50 episodes. And that is so hard for people. It's hard for me to know that like you basically have to. I would talk to another friend who is into comedy, and the idea is you have to write a lot of bad jokes to write a good joke.
Sure.
And he was like, I don't want to write any bad jokes. And I'm like, I know, that's the thing. You don't want to do a bad podcast, but your first one is not going to be your best podcast. So that also was a little bit of like I told you, I recorded 2 that I didn't release. Yeah. That I was like, those are not even up to where I think I'd like the minimum to be. And then I got 1 done that I could put out there. And I felt like, okay, that's good. But now you go back and you're like, oh man, that's not exactly right, but that's it. That's the start. You got to start.
Exactly. Yeah, you got to start somewhere and just keep getting better over time. I'm curious what the relationship is with the podcast, and then you're talking about, you've got the devotional, the curiosities and uncommon sense from the Bible, and then as we were talking about the Bible's funny card game. How have those all worked together? What's the relationship between those?
Yeah, I try to do things that come out naturally. I try not to like get into a project or connect a project to this doesn't feel like sort of a natural outpouring. So the devotional book was born out of those blogs I told you about, oddly enough. So I'd written all those blogs, and then we were talking about what we might do next. And I was like, I do really like that work I put in. I went a little deeper on those blogs. Like the initial release of them, where it was strictly comedic. And then I was like, well, what if we talked a little bit about like what might be a takeaway from this kind of curious passage of the Bible? And then that all came together really nicely. Like it felt, although again, I'll say, and I could literally say this about everything, I was like, I'm not writing a devotional. And then my wife and a couple other people were like, you should though, like it would be good. And I was like, well, I'll try it. This was an exact like quote. I'll try it to show you guys how bad it would be if I wrote a devotional. And I wrote 4. And then I was like, oh, these aren't so bad. I actually like this activity. So that's how devotional was born. The card game was born out of like the meme nature.
Yeah.
I'd gotten into the meme game on Instagram. I love making memes, not ashamed of it. And so there were other games that had kind of like tinkered around with this new gameplay style. What do you meme was one of them. Then it was like, well, I wonder if we could do this with these out of context Bible verses. So that was, again, one of those things you kind of tinker around with it and you're like, oh, this might be something. And so put it together, had a great team that helped me release that. And the response has been like super cool to that.
Yeah.
Again, just back to what we talked about, like it just fills my heart up that I get these pictures or videos from a table, like a family gathering, and they're laughing, and it's the Bible that's at the center of the table. And that's just so cool to me. And it's not in the traditional sense. it is unavoidable that you have this now like positive, joy-filled memory that is directly connected to the Bible. The game just felt like another one of those, like, yeah, this is very much in line with what we're trying to do here. So that's how they all connect, is I think from that just shared heart of, I want the Bible to be presented in interesting ways. I want it to feel approachable to people, and I want it to get in people's hands.
Nice. So what are you excited about for the future of The Bible is Funny? Is there other projects that you've got cooking that you can share?
Well, we've actually been getting a little bit more disciplined with the podcast. So the podcast was a bit irregular for a while. So we've been working more on that, which I'm very happy about. We also are working on more of the card game. That's one of the feedback points I get all the time is we need more. We need expansion packs and stuff. And so I don't know how these things work and how much you're allowed to say when, but I will share to everybody joyfully that we are working on more of that, more of those card games, more of those cards that people can play with. So yeah, those are the things I like the most. It's just a project that, you know, I don't know about you, but like creatively, I move on to the next thing a lot. Like I'm kind of like, all right, we did that. Let's go to the next thing. And the Bible is Funny project has just held my attention so well that I'm just like, I love doing this. I love making the memes. I love making the podcast. Like I want to do more of the same because I'm having so much fun doing it.
Yeah, nice. So on a personal note, what role has this whole project been in your personal faith journey?
Yeah, I think like we talked about a little earlier, it's definitely when I hear people's experiences with the Bible and with church that are so different than mine, how people were introduced to the Bible, how it first appeared in their life, it definitely broadens my awareness of the many roads that people are taking when you talk about this thing. And it's also like made me fall in love with it. Like I talk to people about that a lot, like especially the Old Testament. The spiritual context I grew up in, the church, it was like definitely deprioritized the Old Testament, had this like, you know, Jesus showed up in the Old Testament, doesn't matter anymore, kind of undergirding. I don't know how much that was ever actually stated out loud, but it was kind of like, yeah, those are some stories, but the New Testament is all the Jesus stuff. That's what we like to talk about. So going through this project, anybody who is holding a Bible can see that it's like 60 to 70% Old Testament, and then like the New Testament is significantly smaller. So it's like this big chunk that I felt like I was like discovering for the first time in a lot of ways. It's so rich. In the New Testament, it's mostly done via, you know, you have the Pauline epistles, so you have letters being written to people, and then you have like accounts of Jesus's life in the gospel, and then in Acts, the accounts of the early church. So it's kind of like got a historical place, and it comes from there's some storytelling, but it's in the like presentation of a historical thing. Whereas like the Old Testament is a lot more storytelling. Like it's a lot more like there's just a lot more stories being told like in every part of it. And so, you know, it's walking you through some of David's life and the Judges and all those things. Yeah, just the presence of story in the Old Testament has been a fresh love for me. I love those stories. I love diving into all the little weird details, because that's the other thing the Old Testament does, is it gets into weird details. Like the New Testament, a lot of people are drawn to it. It's a great place to start with the Bible, 100%. You know, a lot of people point people to the book of John, but because it feels more like us, like the Roman culture. It just feels more like where cities were developed culture, all those different things feel like more like, yeah, that sounds a bit like we sound today. Whereas the old school Old Testament stuff, it's just like all kinds of interesting things going on, right? People are like handing each other their sandal when they make a deal, and you're like, whoa, what's going on there? I don't know what that's about. It's just interesting, and I fell in love with the Old Testament throughout this project for sure.
Nice. All right, well, this brings us to the high pass segment where we ignore the lows and I ask you about some of your favorite things. So it's a little bit of a rapid fire here. What's your current favorite book of the Bible?
Oh man, it oscillates so wildly. I have been really drawn to Proverbs lately because it's just so like such a grab bag. Like the topics covered are so like, this is about that. This is about, there's a verse about money. Here's a verse about relationships. Here's a verse about, you're just like, whoa. And it's also like little bite-sized, you know, pieces. So Proverbs has been one I've been loving recently. I find myself drawn to Judges a lot because, as I mentioned, just attracted to crazy stories that are fun and are an adventure and a wild ride. So I like Judges. I like Proverbs. And then usually, as we record this, we're getting closer to Easter. I will walk through some more like gospel stuff. And just, to me, it's just you're picking up that diamond and turning it around to see what jumps out at you. So I'll definitely do some of that in the next couple of weeks.
Nice. Yeah. What's one of your favorite comments from someone who has taken what you do too seriously?
My favorite one is I was called the devil one time. I was outright called the devil. And so it was something about twisting the words to trick people or something like that. And they shared some sort of verse in some sort of version that was like, that's what the devil does or something like that. And I typically am like pretty chill with comments because most people just they haven't even seen anything. They just see the title and this is like kind of where they come from. So I don't go into like, I really love the Bible. Like, it's not what I'm here to do. But most people know that these Bible verses are not about dating apps because dating apps weren't around when they came out. So this is not, it's fairly obvious. For that person, I responded and was like, just for clarification, am I the devil in this comment? Am I the devil in this scenario? And they were like, well, maybe. And I was like, okay, well, just wanted to check.
Oh, yeah. People in commenting. Oh, man. On the internet. The people of the internet.
They're trying to fix things, you know? They're trying to fix things through their comments. I get it. You want to weigh in.
Yeah, but...
You just don't have to come in so hot.
Yeah, you just don't need to call people the devil. You just really don't. That's
When I got it, I was like, had to do some soul searching. And I realized I've never been down to Georgia. You know, never worn Prada. So I can't be the devil. I can't by law.
That's great. So what's your favorite ministry podcast to listen to, or what's a ministry that you wish had a podcast?
Oh, that's good. I'm a pretty big sucker for the stuff the Bible Project puts out.
Yeah.
I don't know if they have a podcast. I think they do.
Yeah.
I think they do have a podcast, which, full disclosure, I've not listened to extensively. I just like what they do. They feel like the other side of what I do. They're very intentional with trying to unpack the meaning and I just like the way that they approach the Bible. It feels like we have a very shared spirit, and they come from like a serious creative place and I come from a funny creative place.
Yeah.
So I like what they do. What's a ministry I wish had a podcast? You know who I like listening to lately, man, is old people. Like,
yeah. Tell me more.
I like, especially being in ministry, not to get like a little heavy at the end, but you see a lot of people fall off and have like a big fall at some point. So what I'm most interested in recently is people who stay the course to the end. I find myself like with people that are like about my age and doing great things with a little bit of like, yeah, okay, well, we'll see where you're at. Like, we'll see if you really even believe this stuff. Because a lot of people, unfortunately, we've found out like, I don't know if you believed it as much as you made us think you believed it because your lifestyle didn't reflect it. But then you get these people who get to the end of their life and they did it all the way to the end, right? Like, they were good fathers, good husbands. They took care of their families. They prioritized the stuff we say you should prioritize. And I find myself more and more like, that's what I want to hear from.
Yeah.
Like, I don't even more so about like, here's what's working right now. There's always stuff to be gained from that. I don't have a specific person in mind when I say that, other than like, I remember I think it was Tim Keller passed sort of recently. And I remember being like, man, like his family and just the outpouring of like his church was like, he just took care of us and loved us. Never lost sight of the important things. I haven't read every book he's ever written. I've not like gone to the nth degree with him, but he's the most recent example I can think of that like caught my eye. That was like, all right, you seem like you did it all the way to the end. And that's what's impressive to me recently is like, we all are chasing after things and varying degrees of success here and there, and that kind of ebbs and flows. But when I hear about people who do it all the way to the end and who stick with it and who finish well, I think is a way people phrase it. That's what I'm most interested in. Those are the voices I've been like, what's important to you? Because I would like to make that important to me.
Yeah.
Make sure I'm not losing sight of anything along the way.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I've had a similar idea, just like it goes back to the Proverbs thing of like, with gray hair comes wisdom or something like that. I can't remember what the exact verse is. Something about, talking to people who have been faithful in the journey of life and learning from them. So I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, there's real like, because success just ebbs and flows. Like, you're like, oh, this person is killing it right now. And it's like, that's great. I want that for everybody. But that doesn't last. Like, nobody, especially today, man, it just feels like content creators, creatives in general, like we just burn through them. Like, you're super hot right now, but in 2 months, like, you are yesterday's news. Like, people are now trashing you. It just is all so cyclical. It feels like and it's always been that way, but it feels like the cycle is even faster now. I just think like, for me, I want like the people that got all the way through it, not just like yes, you're crazy popular right now, and that's cool. There's something to be learned from that person. I'm not saying there's not, but I find myself drawn to that person who's like further down the road. And typically what's so interesting to me is a consistency among what they share is it's very simple. It seems like the world gets simpler. Sure. Whereas you're well, I got to be doing this and I got to be doing this. I got to be growing here and I got to be working on this and I got to be improving here and here and here and here. And then they you talk with somebody like that and they just seem like they're like, well, this is what it kind of boils down to, these 2 or 3 things. Mm-hmm. And you're like, oh man, you're probably right. I'm sure you're right. Yeah. I just get too busy and too wound up. And yeah. I think it'd be but the problem is they don't do podcasts usually, right? Because they're 80 years old. Yeah. And there's
somebody's got to do it though. Somebody's got to do it.
Somebody's got to get the microphone to them and ask them a couple questions and probably edit some of it because they're going to tell a story about some guy they used to live next to, and that's going to go on for 45 minutes. But if we cut that part out of the podcast, they're going to share some really great stuff.
For sure. All right. So last question as we wrap today's episode. If a pastor is thinking about starting a podcast as a project outside of what they're doing on a normal Sunday with sermons and whatnot, what would you say is your best advice for them to get started?
I mean, the first word I always say is just get started. Mm-hmm. Just start. Try something. I err that way. I just try something. Even if you change it completely in 2 episodes, that's fine. But try something. That's always my first thing. I would say secondly, recognize the differences in the platform. So we talked quite a bit about, this is a conversational platform. So this is not a place to just I gave a great sermon on Sunday. Listen to this. Now I'm going to say it in this forum. Mm-hmm. And you can take sermons and make them podcasts. And that's certainly, a lot of people do that. Yeah. And that's digestible content. That's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you're going to, on top of that, do a podcast, lean into the conversational part of it, which means that you are, as the voice, as the trusted creator or speaker, the authoritative figure, you're listening also. You're not just talking constantly. Yeah. Of course, they're probably drawn to the podcast because they like you and they like your opinions and they want to hear your thoughts. But it also means you're giving the space for someone else to chime in or someone else to ask a good question or someone else to be engaged in the conversation. So those are the things I would say. Don't get hung up on the perfection thing. Like I said, just get started, try something, and explore that these can be conversations. I feel like it's a great way to explore the Bible is by talking about it and saying, what jumped out at you? Who's got different things to add for context? That would be my advice. Don't overcomplicate it. Lean into the conversational nature.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that advice. Thank you for taking the time today, Anthony, to chat with me on my podcast about your podcast. It's a lot of fun and hearing more about the work that you're doing. Just thanks for being on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. I've learned so much about how to be a good host. You're so professional. You had research done. You sent me questions beforehand. You're just a gem.
Well, thanks, Anthony. Man, it was a lot of fun to talk with Anthony and hear about how the project that started as an Instagram account has grown into a podcast, devotional, and a card game. I'm going to have to go out and get the Bible is Funny card game and play it with some of our friends because it sounds like a lot of fun. And if you haven't checked out The Bible is Funny on Instagram, do that right after this episode with the link in the show notes, and you'll have a good laugh while getting pulled into the Bible. You can listen to The Bible is Funny podcast with the link in the show notes. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Ministries That Podcast, produced by Sonomorphic. If you enjoyed today's episode, text it to a friend or share it on social media. Together, we can help more ministries grow and thrive through podcasting. And if you haven't already, follow or subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on the next one, and leave a 5-star review while you're at it. Now, come back in 2 weeks to hear my conversation with Jessica and Josh White, the creators behind Kids Bible Stories, a podcast with over 11 million downloads since it started almost 7 years ago. We're going to talk about how Jessica started her podcasting journey back in 2017, how Josh started getting more involved with the script writing and voice acting, and the hard conversations they've had recently about the financial sustainability of the podcast. Well, until next time, keep encouraging your audience as they follow Jesus.